The sun had barely touched the Pacific when Lieutenant Jack Mercer rolled his B-25 onto the deck of the Sky, engines screaming like war drums. Below, a line of Japanese ships carved silver trails through the dawn mist. Every pilot before him had failed to stop them. But Mercer was not here to try. He was here to change everything. What he carried under those wings was not standard issue. It was an idea so bold it would shock even his own commanders. Before we start, hit that like button and tell us where you're watching from. Your support keeps these incredible wow stories alive. The dawn over the Bismarck Sea carried a strange silence, the kind that felt heavy, almost unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The ocean below was calm, but somewhere beneath that peace, danger was already in motion. Lieutenant Jack Mercer adjusted his headset, his gloved hand steady on the control column of his B-25 Mitchell. His bomber trembled slightly as its engines roared against the humid air. Around him, the crew worked in quiet focus. Men who had been awake since midnight, faces lit by the faint red glow of cockpit lamps. They had done this before, dozens of times, but today was different. This time, they were flying something that should not exist. The B-25 had been born a medium bomber, a tool of precision strikes and altitude raids. It was never meant to tear through ships at wave-top height. But Jack Mercer believed machines could be more than their manuals allowed. The Air Force had rules. He had results. The modification beneath his hands was his own invention, an untested monster of metal and instinct. The nose of his aircraft no longer carried a bombardier. It carried something else entirely, 14 forward-firing guns, all wired to fire at once. It looked unnatural, brutal, and dangerous, even to its own crew. But to Mercer, it was perfect. Below, the faint shadows of Japanese transports moved across the mist. Convoy 312, 8 ships carrying fuel, munitions, and men. Protected by destroyers armed with anti-air batteries and confident that no bomber could strike low enough to matter. They had seen American planes before, high, predictable, cautious. They had never seen this. Mercer's crew watched the sea tilt in the windows as he pushed the Mitchell lower, skimming the whitecaps until salt spray dotted the nose glass. The engines thundered. The altimeter dropped. One wrong movement and they would crash into the ocean. But Jack Mercer's voice was calm when he spoke into the intercom. "Hold tight, boys. We are rewriting the rules today." Far behind them, radio chatter filled the airwaves. Command had not approved the mission. They had warned him this test was suicidal. They said a bomber could not behave like a fighter. But Mercer had seen what the Japanese convoys did to Allied troops stranded without supplies. He had seen destroyers shred rescue boats, leaving only oil and smoke on the surface. To him, the risk was worth everything. If his experiment worked, it could change the Pacific War overnight. At 300 feet, the sky seemed to merge with the ocean. The horizon vanished. Ahead, faint flashes of sunlight glinted off metal hulls. Mercer exhaled slowly, feeling his heartbeat in his fingertips. He could almost hear the Japanese crews below, unaware that death was coming from the clouds in a form they had never imagined. He opened the safety covers, thumb hovering over the trigger switch that linked 14 guns to one command. He did not blink. When the first shells erupted, the sea exploded into chaos. Flames tore through the deck of a transport ship as tracer rounds ripped across the formation. The air filled with smoke, salt, and disbelief. From the coast, it looked like a storm had fallen out of the sky. Mercer's B-25 darted through the haze, low enough for the heat of burning ships to lick its fuselage. Behind him, his crew shouted through the intercom, unable to believe what they were seeing. For a moment, even Mercer forgot to breathe. The guns roared again, steady, relentless. It was no longer a bomber. It was something new, a flying wall of firepower that turned steel and ambition into destruction. In less than 5 minutes, 3 ships were burning, 1 was sinking, and the rest scattered in panic. The Japanese convoy had never seen a weapon like this. Neither had the U.S. Army Air Forces. As Mercer pulled up through the black smoke, the morning sky turned golden again. The ocean below was littered with wreckage and fire. He said nothing into the radio. He just looked at what they had done and whispered to himself, "It works!" The crew sat in stunned silence. What had begun as one man's reckless dream had just become the birth of a new kind of warfare. And somewhere in the distance, word began to spread about the pilot who defied orders and the bomber that should never have existed. The mission's aftermath spread across the Pacific like a whispered legend. Within days, air crews from Port Moresby to Guadalcanal spoke of the pilot who had flown a B-25 like a fighter and left an entire Japanese convoy in flames. No one knew if the story was true. Some said it was luck, others called it madness. But in the dim light of the operations hut, the engineers who examined Mercer's aircraft saw something different. The nose was scorched, the paint blistered, and every gun barrel was blackened from heat. Yet the aircraft had survived. Against every expectation, it had come home. Jack Mercer stood quietly beside the wreck-streaked bomber as officers debated what to do with him. He had defied direct orders, flown beyond approved limits, and modified government property without authorization. But he had also destroyed 4 enemy ships in a single sortie and returned with proof that the concept worked. Behind closed doors, command officers argued. Was he a hero or a dangerous example? The Pacific War demanded results, not perfection, and results spoke louder than regulations. A week later, the base mechanics gathered around Mercer's B-25, studying its weapon layout like a new invention. They called it the Fire Nose. It carried no bombs, no torpedoes, only raw forward firepower. The design made perfect sense in theory, but impossible in practice. The recoil from 14 guns could tear the frame apart. Yet Mercer's team had reinforced the mounts with steel bracing scavenged from damaged aircraft. They had balanced the weight by removing bomb racks, adding armor plates under the cockpit, and stripping everything unnecessary for survival. It was crude, heavy, and ugly. But it worked. When the Air Force liaison arrived from Brisbane, he expected a reprimand. Instead, he found a crowd of pilots studying blueprints, measuring mounts, and calculating recoil forces. Something was changing. In an army built on hierarchy, one man's defiance had opened a door no engineer had dared to touch. The liaison watched Mercer demonstrate how each gun was linked to a single trigger switch, allowing synchronized bursts that could cut through ships, trucks, or even concrete. "It is not elegant," Mercer said, "but war rarely is." Back in Washington, reports from the field reached the desk of Colonel Nathan Hale, an operations planner known for taking risks. The documents were brief but electrifying. A single modified B-25 had eliminated a convoy without losing altitude, with no escort, and in less than 10 minutes. Hale did not believe in myths, but he believed in math. He saw potential, and in that potential an answer to the Japanese tactic of night resupply. Within hours, he sent a cable, authorized prototype evaluation, repeat Mercer configuration. By April, mechanics at multiple island bases were building their own versions of the modification. Some worked, others failed spectacularly, melting gun barrels or snapping mounts. But the idea had spread faster than any order could control. Pilots traded notes in mess tents, sharing sketches and measurements written on ration boxes. They called them gunships. No one had yet used that word officially, but everyone understood what it meant. The bomber was no longer a support aircraft. It was becoming a weapon of direct confrontation. Mercer continued flying test runs, each one pushing the design further. He studied angles, recoil paths, and armor stress, often flying with spare parts strapped to the floor. His crew joked that he trusted math more than luck. They were not wrong. He measured every burst, every bullet path, recording results with obsessive precision. To him, this was not rebellion. It was evolution. The war had forced ordinary men to become engineers, and engineers to become warriors. At night, the jungle airstrip glowed with the faint light of welding torches as crews worked through the darkness. The smell of hot metal and fuel mixed with the ocean wind. It felt like the birth of something dangerous and unstoppable. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese convoys continued to move, believing the skies still belonged to them. But in the humid silence of New Guinea, a new kind of thunder was being forged, one that would soon roar across the Pacific and change the war's rhythm forever. The first official test of the new B-25 gunship came at dawn on a windswept strip near Oro Bay. The air smelled of oil, salt, and tension. Mechanics tightened bolts until their hands bled, and pilots stood beside their aircraft in silence, listening to the sea beyond the trees. The experiment that had begun with Lieutenant Jack Mercer's disobedience had now become a sanctioned mission. Command wanted results they could measure, and Mercer was the man expected to deliver them. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew this test would decide the future of the design, and possibly his career. The target was simple on paper, a Japanese resupply convoy moving north with fuel and ammunition, protected by destroyers and flak barges. For weeks, these convoys had slipped through night after night, keeping Japanese bases alive along the coast of New Guinea. Standard bombers had failed to stop them. High-altitude raids scattered the ships but caused little damage. This time would be different. Mercer's B-25 was stripped for speed, its guns calibrated for short bursts at close range. The crew wore light flight gear, the weight of survival gear replaced by extra ammunition. The morning light turned the sea into a blinding mirror. Mercer's formation of 6 aircraft climbed to 1,000 feet, engines humming like a metallic choir. Over the intercom, his voice was calm, deliberate. "Keep your lines tight. Fire only on my mark," the radio crackled with acknowledgement. Each man in that sky knew they were part of something untested, something that might change how airmen fought across the Pacific. The silence between breaths felt heavier than the roar of the engines. At 07:46, radar operators on the coast picked up enemy echoes, 10 ships moving south in 2 parallel columns. The Japanese gunners were alert, their barrels already turning toward the incoming sound. Mercer's lead aircraft broke formation, diving low, skimming over the waves. The rest followed. The distance closed in seconds. The first bursts of anti-aircraft fire tore through the air, bright orange flashes against the mist. Mercer felt the vibration of near hits, but did not pull up. He steadied his aim, eyes fixed on the largest transport ahead. When the trigger depressed, the gun spoke with one voice. The nose of the B-25 erupted in fire and smoke, a solid wall of tracers that tore into the enemy deck. The sound was deafening, like thunder rolling through steel. Explosions rippled across the convoy as fuel drums ignited. Japanese sailors scattered, some leaping overboard as the lead ship vanished behind a curtain of flame. Mercer swung wide, banking left to give his wingmen a clear run. One after another, the modified bombers struck, their gunfire carving lines of destruction through the formation. The attack lasted less than 7 minutes. When it ended, the sea was a graveyard of twisted metal and burning oil. 4 transports were gone. 2 destroyers were crippled and drifting. The remaining ships fled north, pursued by strafing runs that seemed endless. Mercer's aircraft returned to base with bullet holes along the fuselage and empty ammunition racks. As he taxied to a stop, ground crew surrounded the plane in stunned silence. They had seen what no one had thought possible, a bomber that fought like a fighter and survived. That evening, command officers gathered in the operations tent, their faces lit by the glow of a single lantern. The reports were clear, the results undeniable. Losses, none. Enemy destroyed, multiple. A concept once dismissed as reckless had just proven itself in combat. The message that left New Guinea that night carried a new directive. All available B-25s to be modified immediately for low-level attack. It was not a suggestion, it was a command. As darkness settled over the jungle, Mercer sat outside his tent, staring at the faint orange glow on the horizon where the battle had been. The war felt different now. The rules had shifted. The air itself seemed heavier with purpose. He did not know it yet, but his creation had started a revolution. Across the Pacific, other pilots would soon fly with the same idea, turning bombers into gunships, airmen into inventors, and the tide of war into something no strategist could have predicted. Word spread across the Pacific like wildfire. Crews stationed from Australia to the Solomons began asking for the Pappy setup, a nickname born from the man behind it all, Major Paul Pappy Gunn. His legend had already started to grow, whispered in airfields and over crackling radios. Some said he could rebuild a bomber with a wrench in one hand and a cigar in the other. Others swore he flew lower than any sane man ever would. But the truth was simpler. Pappy Gunn hated waste, especially wasted firepower. And in his mind, the B-25 still had untapped fury waiting to be unleashed. When Gunn heard about Lieutenant Mercer's combat success, he did not celebrate. He wanted more. More speed, more guns, more precision. He gathered his mechanics in a tin hangar under the blistering New Guinea sun and pointed at a chalk outline of the B-25 drawn on the wall. "We are not building bombers anymore," he said quietly. "We are building Predators." His crew nodded without hesitation. They had seen what the enemy convoys could do to Allied supply lines. Every ship sunk by Japan was another man starved, another base cut off. Gunn's version of victory would be mechanical vengeance, built from the bones of a medium bomber. They stripped the aircraft down to its frame, removing unnecessary weight and replacing standard mounts with heavy machine gun brackets that looked almost improvised. 6 .50 calibers in the nose, 4 more inside pods, 2 beneath the cockpit. The result looked monstrous, like a shark bristling with teeth. The moment it rolled out of the hangar, pilots stopped what they were doing just to stare. The engines coughed to life, the guns gleaming like polished brass under the morning light. When Gunn stepped into the cockpit for the test flight, even the ground crew fell silent. He flew low over the jungle, tree branches bending under the slipstream, the roar echoing like rolling thunder. He returned an hour later, landing smooth and steady, smoke rising from the barrels. The grin on his face told the story before he even spoke. "It works," he said. "Now let us make it mean." Within weeks, dozens of B-25s were modified, following Gunn's pattern. What started as a field experiment became an official transformation program. Supply officers scrambled to ship extra ammunition. Armorers worked through the night, hands blackened by oil and gunpowder. Each squadron that received one of the modified planes felt the same jolt of pride and fear. These were not just bombers anymore. They were instruments of precision destruction, built for the brutal geometry of low-altitude warfare. By late 1943, the gunship B-25s began appearing in formation over the Bismarck Sea. Their reputation preceded them. Japanese sailors learned to fear the growl of twin radial engines hugging the waves, for it meant death was coming fast, too fast for their gunners to react. The planes would swoop in almost level with the mast, guns blazing from every angle, slicing through convoys in seconds. Radio intercepts recorded panic in enemy transmissions, voices shouting, "The new Americans are not bombing, they are cutting us apart." Gunn's design had changed not just the air war, but the psychology of the Pacific. Still, the toll on the men was heavy. Flying that low left no margin for error. One wrong move meant clipping a mast or slamming into the sea. Gunn himself buried more than a few pilots he had trained. Yet every loss seemed to strengthen his resolve. He would stand by the runway as the planes returned from missions, counting each one silently, cigarette trembling between his fingers. When a damaged plane limped home on one engine, he would walk out onto the strip himself, wave the crew in, and help pull the wounded from the cockpit. He never looked away from the reality of what his creation cost. That winter, a radio broadcast from the front described the new B-25 squadrons as flying sledgehammers. American morale soared. For the first time, the enemy convoys that once ruled the Pacific lanes began to vanish. Pappy Gunn's idea had become a doctrine, proof that ingenuity could outmatch numbers and courage could turn machines into legends. But behind every victory, he carried a growing weight, the knowledge that his weapon was born not from glory, but from necessity. And deep down he knew the war was not finished testing what men like him could endure. The final phase of Pappy Gunn's revolution arrived not with fanfare, but with silence, the kind that falls before a storm. It was spring of 1944, and the Pacific had become a chessboard of shifting tides. The Japanese convoys that once moved freely now crawled through darkness, hugging coastlines, terrified of what waited above the waves. The low, haunting growl of the modified B-25s had become a sound every sailor recognized. It meant they were already too late. But for Gunn and his men, Victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival balanced on a knife's edge. The war had changed them. Pilots who once flew high and cautious now thundered over treetops with gun barrels blazing, trusting instinct over instruments. Each mission pushed the limits of courage and control. The air was their enemy as much as the Japanese below. Turbulence, shrapnel, and the violent recoil of their own firepower tested both machine and man. Yet the crews kept flying because the results spoke louder than fear. Convoy after convoy was obliterated. Japanese outposts began running dry on supplies. The once powerful Imperial Navy struggled to keep its smaller vessels afloat. What had started as one man's mechanical experiment had become a weapon reshaping the Pacific Front. In March, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea's follow-up operations, Gunn personally supervised the largest coordinated gunship strike to date. 40 B-25s took off from Port Moresby at dawn, engines roaring in unison, propellers slicing through fog thick as milk. From the ground, the formation looked like a moving storm. The crews called themselves Gunn's Ghosts because they knew few enemies lived long enough to describe what they saw. Their targets that morning were 2 destroyers and a cluster of cargo ships retreating toward Rabaul. The weather was brutal, rain slashing sideways, lightning dancing across the horizon, but Gunn insisted they press forward. "The enemy will not expect us in this," he said. "That is why we go." When they reached visual range, the sky cracked open with anti-aircraft fire. The gunners on the Japanese ships fired blindly, unable to track the fast-moving bombers streaking just above the waves. Gunn's lead plane dove first, his tracers cutting across the sea like glowing arrows. The air filled with the thunder of synchronized .50 calibers, hundreds of rounds per second tearing through decks, fuel lines, and gun mounts. One ship erupted in flames so bright it lit the undersides of the clouds. Within minutes, the sea became chaos, ships colliding, sailors diving, ammunition cooking off in bursts of fire. Gunn's Ghosts made 3 passes, each one lower and deadlier than the last. When it was over, nothing floated upright. As the survivors turned home, the radio chatter was minimal. The excitement that followed most victories was gone. They had become efficient, almost mechanical in their destruction. Gunn knew that meant the line between man and machine had blurred. He stared out the cockpit window on the flight back, the rain streaking across the glass, and wondered how many more missions it would take before there was nothing left of the men inside these aircraft except the mission itself. Yet he also knew the price was not in vain. Every convoy destroyed shortened the war by days, maybe weeks. Every pilot who returned gave others a chance to live. Months later, the U.S. Army officially adopted the gunship configuration for future B-25 operations. Newspapers back home called it Gunn's Miracle. The headlines celebrated innovation and bravery, but few understood what it truly cost. Gunn refused to attend the award ceremony held in his honor. He remained at his airfield, tuning engines and sketching new modifications. For him, recognition was meaningless unless it saved lives. He once told a young mechanic, "If we can make it better, we must." The war will not wait for medals. By the time the Pacific fell quiet in 1945, the B-25 had become a legend. Not because of its design, but because of the men who dared to fly it the way no one else could. From the jungles of New Guinea to the coral skies of the Philippines, its roar became the sound of American ingenuity and courage intertwined. When the last mission ended, Pappy Gunn walked alone down the runway, the setting sun reflecting off empty gun barrels. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the echo of what men had built, fought for, and endured to end a war that had changed the world forever.